Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Daniel McAdams. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks for having me back, Jay.
Really good to talk to you as always. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit today, or have you talk to us a little bit, I should say, about what's been going on in Hong Kong. We just spoke to Peter Treadway, who's actually has been a professor in Hong Kong. He's from the United States. He is manages money from Hong Kong and from New York, but has a pretty good grasp, I think, of the people of Hong Kong since he lives there and has lived there for so many years. And he's talking about these protests that have been going on. It's it seems like a sort of a carryover from Occupy Wall Street. It was an Occupy Hong Kong movement that Mrs. Taylor and I ran into a few years ago when we were over in Hong Kong, and it reminded me so much of Occupy Wall Street, which I also visited here in New York when that was going on a few years back. And I just, it amazes me that somehow these supposedly spontaneous uprisings take place. I don't know how spontaneous they are, and I that's one of the things I want to ask you about. But you had an interesting article on the Ron Paul Institute website on Monday titled "Hong Kong Boiling, but Gently So Far." Can you sort of summarize that article, what it's about, and what the gist of it is?
Sure. Well, it's written by one of our academic advisors, Eric Margulies, who's a well-traveled and really a top-notch international affairs correspondent. I think he's been writing for decades about current affairs and geopolitics.
Mm-hmm.
But as we've seen in the past few days, this movement that looked like it was going to get out of hand, this protest movement, seems to have simmered down quite a bit in the past, say, 24 hours or so, 2 days. And it looks like, at least for now, it's not going to turn into another Kiev where you have a violent overthrow of a government or anything of that nature. And pardon me, I'll be the first to admit I don't know all of the details, because I think the details are too complicated to know, especially for us thousands of miles away.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a few days in Hong Kong a few years ago, and my impressions were that it was a city that very, very deeply and profoundly rests on business,
Mm-hmm.
and on doing business. And from what I've seen in the past 24 hours or so, it seems like the people whose business is business in Hong Kong had gotten tired of these people sitting around blocking traffic, blocking commerce
Yeah.
in some of the main parts of town. And there was some violence, and the violence was not just police against protesters. I think more interesting, a lot of the violence was people who did not want the city taken over by people laying around for months,
Yeah.
destroying business.
Yeah.
The beef that these students supposedly had was that they, as your readers, I'm sure, your listeners already know, that the chief executive to be elected for Hong Kong has to go through the approval process from Beijing. It's not just someone that they can pick at will.
Mm-hmm.
We may find that somewhat disconcerting. However, we have the same thing. It's called the primary process.
Yes, indeed. And who we're allowed to vote for, right?
Yeah, where the political elite get to choose who gets to
Right.
run. And if anyone doubts that, just go back and Google, Ron Paul 2012.
Yeah, for sure.
What happens if that's not the case? But nevertheless, this was their beef at first. Never mind the fact that while Hong Kong was ruled as a part of the British Empire, they never were allowed to vote on anything.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it does seem to have died down. But one of the things that Eric touches on, he touches on the NGOs a little bit, and I wrote a piece actually last week about the NGOs. And the fact of the matter is, whatever you think about the protests in Taiwan, whether you think it's fantastic to have democracy breaking out everywhere, or whether you're a little more cynical, like I'm afraid you and I are, Jay.
I'm afraid I am.
But regardless of that, the fact of the matter is the U.S. government has been involved in this from the beginning. The Moon of Alabama website pointed out a National Endowment for Democracy grant. Now, the NED is directly funded by the U.S. taxpayer,
Mm-hmm.
although conveniently for them, they consider themselves an independent corporation,
Yeah.
100% funded by us, which means
Yeah.
we don't control them, but we have to pay for them.
You're right. What a
But
deal.
yeah, exactly. But there are grants of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that the National Endowment for Democracy has made to these groups that are now leading the protests.
Hmm.
And you also have some business people, for example, Jimmy Lai. He's the head of Next Media, which is very very solidly behind the protests in Hong Kong, and he is deeply connected with the neocons here in the U.S. As a matter
Oh.
of fact, there was a leak of some correspondence between his top guy, his editor in chief, I believe he is, and others talking about this media mogul Jimmy Lai's um, um, time he spent with Paul Wolfowitz. They took
Oh my goodness.
several trips to Myanmar together, and apparently good buddies. Apparently, he paid Wolfowitz $75,000 for his help in Myanmar. So you do have the hands of the neocons involved in it as well through the NED and through this media mogul with strong ties
Uh-huh.
to the U.S. government.
Hmm.
So you do have that as well. So
Hmm.
it's not a pure, regardless of whether or not the average protester out there was pure at heart, and I'm sure a lot of them were very well-meaning, and
Right.
they didn't know they were a part of some plot.
Right.
I think we may have talked about it a little bit last time, Jay. I think the U.S. is very concerned that its sanctions against Russia are backfiring, and rather than bringing Russia to its knees, although they are hurting the economy, anytime you mess with trade, you hurt an economy, but they're not bringing Russia to its knees. Rather, they are sending Russia into the arms of China.
Absolutely. I couldn't
And
agree with you more on that.
exactly, and I think that might be why you see some of this unrest, and maybe the pullback now is just to serve as a warning that, hey, we can turn this on and off anytime we want, so be
Hmm.
careful.
Yeah, Daniel, it seems to me from a bigger geopolitical perspective, this makes a certain amount of sense. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is what Obama's pushing, and I'm not really sure where that stands right now. I don't know if you have any comment on that, but that was meant to sort of seal off China from the rest of the Asian nations as much as possible. And then we've had Stephen Harner on this show. Stephen has been an academic. Actually, he actually worked for the State Department in the past. He now manages money out of Tokyo, and he's incensed by the fact that the U.S. doesn't want the Chinese Navy to have to protect its own sea lanes, and the U.S. wants to do it for China. So it seems to me all this and the neocons, now you bring them into the picture, it certainly makes a certain amount of sense. You foment problems and dissidents among the students who don't really have to, as Peter Treadway was saying a few minutes ago, don't really have to worry about earning a living. Most of these kids, he says, most of these, if not all of these kids, are living off their parents. And he noted that it was the merchants that were really upset. Their businesses were being disrupted by these kids that were parking themselves in the streets and basically not allowing. So it was really the sort of middle class, the people that are really hardworking, wanting to continue get on with their lives, that were upset about this Occupy movement. And but it's interesting how it sort of. I mean, you talk all the time about how we are involved with the NGOs and the CIA and so forth. John Perkins has been on this show talking about how the sort of modus operandi seems to be almost everywhere where we go. The U.S. goes into different countries and foments problems, gets unrest, and then starts the ball rolling. And it seems to me, Daniel, wherever we go, we create chaos. And then what is the idea that somehow we gain control because everything is just mucked up?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the CIA, because another interesting point about Hong Kong is that the right-hand man of Jimmy Lai, this is the media mogul.
Uh-huh.
His name is Mark Simon, and he has a long history with the CIA and naval intelligence.
Ah.
So there's an interesting article in the South China Morning Post. It says, "I'm not a spy," said Jimmy Lai's right-hand man.
Huh.
It says, "My dad was CIA for 35 years. My internship with CIA, 4 years of naval intelligence."
Huh.
So here's a guy who's definitely at least steeped in the spooky stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
that goes back to John Perkins.
Mm-hmm.
these a lot of Americans will go over and get jobs in places like this, and they basically will have two masters that they report to.
Yeah. Well,
So
it's sort of things have thankfully have calmed down there for now, and let's hope that that continues to be the case. But you never know. I mean, if where there's a will, there's a way on the part of the neocons to stir things up, it seems. And they have endless amounts of money up until now, at least to spend. And as you say, these NGOs many times get the taxpayers to pay for it, but we have no control over it. So what else is new when it comes to government
yeah.
activities? Another article that appeared on the Ron Paul Institute that I thought was really interesting, and I like if you can walk us through this, David Stockman's article, The Siege of Kobani, Obama's Syrian Fiasco in Motion. Could you have perhaps give our listeners a sense of what that story is all about?
Well, this is, I think, a really fascinating story, and it's going on right now, really, as we speak. It's certainly from the beginning of the week. It's been ongoing, and this is a village on the border between Syria and Turkey, and
Hmm.
essentially it's a Kurdish village, and the Kurds in the region have had sort of a tacit agreement with the Assad government that we are we are not going to stir up trouble here for you, and in exchange you won't bomb us, and it's
Hmm.
worked fairly well so far. But now in comes ISIS, that the U.S. is supposed to be fighting. That's what they told us, at least.
Yeah,
And
even though we helped build them up to start with.
with our allies. But so now this village, Kobani, is surrounded by ISIS fighters. The U.S. is in the vicinity. The Turkish army is in the vicinity, and neither of them are lifting a finger. And not that I encourage the bombing of ISIS, but if you take at face value what they've said that the U.S. intervention is about, if you take that at face value and you look at what's happening in this village, you'll see that they're lying to us. It has very little to do with ISIS.
Hmm.
And actually, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has told the leaders of this Turkish militia in Kobani that the only way you're going to get our help is if you join the Free Syrian Army and dedicate yourselves to overthrowing Assad.
Hmm.
So to our wonderful ally Turkey, the overthrow of Assad is much more important than taking out this ISIS threat that we're told is the most terrifying thing in history and that they're all coming to kill us.
Yeah, they're chopping off heads.
Chopping off heads, and I this is a great quote from Stockman, and I love reading David Stockman's work. But this is, if I can just, if
Sure.
you'll bear with me, he says, "Never in recorded history has a fading imperial power conducted a more feckless, pointless, and strategically irrational war. The U.S. beheadings are surely barbaric, but they pose no threat to the security and safety of the American people that can't be handled by enhanced domestic vigilance and police protection."
Right.
So that's it. It's
Yeah.
the whole thing was a false pretext, a couple of beheadings, and now that we're in there, it's day by day becoming less and less about ISIS and more about overthrowing the Assad government, which they were prevented from doing last year.
Right. Well, of course, there were the neocons that wanted us to get involved in that to start with. Why? So we are finally getting involved with that to overthrow
Well, that's what it's
this.
about, and that's why
Yeah.
Turkey keeps pleading with the U.S. to establish a no-fly zone in Syria,
Uh-huh.
because they don't want Assad taking advantage of any rollback of ISIS,
Uh-huh.
because that's their real target. So
Hmm.
these are our allies. Saudi Arabia, according to, I think we spoke about it last time, this article in the Wall Street Journal, they demanded as a price for signing on to this coalition that the U.S. rededicate itself to overthrowing Assad. So
Yeah.
this is just by another means what they had intended to do last year.
Yeah.
And
Well,
the other thing, sorry to interrupt you, Jay, but
yeah.
the other thing I was just reading today is that now the price tag already for these few bombing missions, I shouldn't say few because there are quite a few, but the price tag is now $1 billion. $1 billion.
Hmm.
And this is changing the subject, but this article that I read put the two of them together because it's important. The president has now just pledged almost another $1 billion to help fight Ebola in Africa.
Hmm.
This is a bankrupt country, and yet we're going around throwing billions and you can be sure there'll be several zeros probably added to that billion spent in Syria and Iraq before this whole thing is over.
Hmm.
Uh,
Daniel, let me ask you if the U.S. gets involved then in the overthrow of the Assyrian government, uh, might that not invite more hostility rather than less with Russia?
I would think certainly it would. It would involve the departure of the Russian naval base, that is on the Syrian coast. That's for sure.
Hmm.
Russia has been pretty quiet about this so far, and I think it's because Russia does agree with the idea of taking out Islamic terrorists.
Uh-huh.
They've had to deal with radicalism in their country, so I think they may be sort of making a tactical decision to hope that the U.S. will actually do what it says. I think that's a mistake to trust Washington in this. But if Assad leaves, and I'm not a cheerleader for anyone, but if he leaves, it will be ISIS that takes over. Whether they call themselves FSA, Free Syrian Army, Al-Nusra Front, or whether they call themselves cuddly puppy dogs. In reality, it will be radical militant Sunni Islam that will take over yet another country that the U.S. has quote unquote liberated. And if and already in parts of Iraq that have been liberated by ISIS, which the U.S., as you well know, has helped, they have women-only shopping malls where women have to go and be covered. It looks like something out of Saudi Arabia.
No.
So all of the women that are in the White House today talking about liberating women and women's rights in these areas, guess what? Things get much, much worse for women
Yeah.
when these people take over.
Yeah,
But
it's the opposite effect.
sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. So
It just seems to be everywhere. I mean, all these governments, which once were much more or much more secular, are now becoming radicalized Islamic states. It seems almost everywhere you go, whether it's Egypt or wherever, right? And the Christians are getting the brunt of it, the worst end of it. It seems of all the groups.
it seems that way, but the U.S. has to be careful. As a matter of fact, David Ignatius, who is the resident, I shouldn't say resident, he's one of the team of pro-war neocon, radicals on the Washington Post staff. He wrote a piece last week that said, gee, it's going to look awfully bad if the only people we bomb are Muslim militants. So we need to start taking out some others and maybe
Oh
do
my
something
goodness.
about Christians or others. So
Oh yeah. We got to be equal.
yeah,
We have to be spread the equality when it comes to killing people.
yeah, affirmative action in bombing.
Affirmative action and killing. Yes, we should kill all kinds of people. Sounds a little bit like almost like Hitler. Until we get down to the Aryan race, and then everybody else that's not perfect with blue eyes and blonde hair will have to
Yeah.
go.
I mean, it
So
really is sick. You're right.
it's in some ways almost reminding a reminder of that. Well, but we know, Daniel, if we only would have the Republicans come into power in the Senate and run our government, if we could have a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House, then we could really restore order, right?
Yeah, you're probably referring to a wonderful interview that we ran with Dr. Paul on the Alan Colmes show,
Uh-huh.
and where it's fun to watch, and it's on our website if anyone wants to see it.
Sure.
But they both sort of commiserated in a way that Alan Colmes, who tends to be on the left, and he
Yeah.
was talking about how horrible the progressives are. They've all lined up behind Obama's war because it's Obama, and then they certainly pointed out how the Republicans have gotten behind it, and their only complaint is that the president's not bombing enough, harder and faster.
Yep.
But he said, interestingly, Dr. Paul said, generally speaking, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference which party controls the Senate, which is absolutely true. The love of the Fed, the love of central planning, the love of war, the love of impoverishing the rest of us who work for a living, that's shared by both parties.
Uh-huh. No, for sure. That's absolutely right. I mean, we were, I was just talking to someone a little while ago, actually about the whole banking crisis in 2008, 2009. And my argument was if the Democrats were real true Keynesians, they would have sent the money out to they would instead of giving trillions of dollars to the bankers, they would have given trillions of dollars to in checks to the lower income groups, and then have a bottoms up economic revival and economic growth. But in fact, the Democrats took care of the boys at Goldman Sachs, and just as the Republicans would take care of the boys at J.P. Morgan, and it doesn't really make any difference, does it? I mean, it's all about a ruling elite taking care of their own. And so, is that really why? I mean, where in the United States, where in the world does the United States not have some presence? I don't think there's hardly a country. I mean, my brother's down in Belize, Central America. That seems like a tiny little third world country but I would imagine even there must be some presence. But we look at the active areas. You've got Ukraine, Syria, Iraq. Now we're in possibly some things going on in Hong Kong. We're everywhere. Why in the world? Help us understand the linkage between the powerful banking interests that run and control the Fed and this constant warmongering.
Well, we're everywhere, and we're completely broke. We're throwing millions and billions and billions of dollars around.
But we can always print more money,
Yeah,
or at least
exactly.
up until this point we've been able to.
But I think one of the things that I talk about a lot is if you look who drives the policy, there's a revolving door between government and the different NGOs in Washington, the Beltway think tanks.
Uh-huh.
And if you look at where they get their money from the military-industrial complex. They get it from there, and they also get it from foreign countries, foreign governments.
Mm-hmm.
Of all places. I think we talked about this, Jay. The
Mm-hmm.
New York Times a few weeks ago ran a fascinating piece on how the major think tanks, CSIS, Brookings, and the others, they rake in millions and millions of dollars from the government of Qatar, the
Yeah.
government of the United Arab Emirates.
Right.
So it's a way for them to get around the requirement to report as a foreign agent. They give money to these NGOs to do their bidding, and so that's why you see all of the things that are on the foreign agenda of Saudi Arabia being proposed by Brookings and think tanks like that. It's a huge scandal, but
Yeah.
nobody talks about it because there's billions of dollars we're talking about.
Yeah. So there's so much money that the media, the military-industrial complex, and all that it's not just guns. It's the banking system, the media system. It's large corporate interests that are tied in with those banking interests, and there's so much money involved. There's so much wealth that the ruling elite enjoys at the expense, sort of parasitically robbing and raping the population, essentially. That they have to lie about it, because if the common folks understood what we're talking about here, Daniel, and this is why it's so difficult for the Ron Paul Institute to get any funding, honestly, is because the big money, and even people who might agree and understand what you're talking about, they're not so sure they want to sacrifice what they might have to sacrifice if they started really getting behind the Ron Paul Institute. That's my theory. I don't know if I'm right.
That,
And I would appeal to our listeners out there uh, to contribute a little bit to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity if you understand, or if you agree with me, that it's so important for people to understand what's really going on. I mean, I guess you could throw in the towel and say it's all over, Daniel. I mean, you could say this empire is so far gone that there isn't any hope for turning it back. I suppose there's people saying that out there,
well, it's
but
easy to fall into despair, but I agree with you. We can't do that.
yeah, I don't think it's right to do that. I think when you have to stand up for what's right, and I applaud you and Dr. Paul. Well, Dr. Paul, I mean, just an amazing man who never really gave in to any principles for the sake of votes. And I
No,
just
when I get down, he cheers me up.
yeah,
He's
yeah,
optimistic, and I do fall into despair sometimes.
yeah,
But I'm proud of what he's doing. We are unique. We stood against these things even when a lot of our allies were saying, "Yeah, but this time we got to go against ISIS. We got to do this,"
mm-hmm,
And Dr. Paul has always stood on principle. And
mm-hmm,
and as you know, what you get for that is really scorn. By some in some quarters. Oh, we're paid by Putin. This, that.
yeah,
the sad fact is we're not paid by any. We're paid by the people who give us small donations, and we're so grateful to them.
Yeah, well, Daniel, I suppose if you were paid by Putin, you could live in a little more luxurious surroundings and probably not have to drive halfway across the country to save money, air flight money, to get from Texas to Washington when you go up there.
I'd
You
have,
could probably have your own plane even, or somebody could fly you. I don't think you're living that way, and I know you're not. So, but if we just had some clarity. If we just had some clarity, Barack Obama lacks it, according to Donald Rumsfeld. What does Rumsfeld is very clear about things, I guess, and he would, if we just could get a Republican into the White House. But you can see this coming, can't you? I mean, I'm hearing that we're going to have we'll be given a choice to choose between Hillary or the other Bush, the younger one down
oh
there in
yeah,
Florida.
yeah.
Do you think that's likely to happen?
I don't know. I'm not an expert on voting, Jay. I'm not a huge fan
No,
of
I'm not a
voting.
huge
So,
fan of voting even anymore.
but if the question is whether we'll probably see two very similar candidates, I'm afraid that's probably where the good money is, the smart
Right,
money is.
right.
Unfortunately, there's really no hope. And Dr. Paul says this himself. The leaders will follow when the people have changed their mind. When the people find that they're sick of this interventionist foreign policy, the leaders will follow, and that is one of the reasons. That is the main reason we do what we do.
Hmm.
We don't have any illusion that we're going to change politics at the Ron Paul Institute. We don't have millions to throw around to buy politicians.
Yeah.
But if we can provide people with some of the tools to start questioning these things,
Hmm.
that's how change happens.
Yeah.
It really is. And so that's why we're optimistic and we don't throw up our hands.
Hmm.
And, we're pushing 100,000 Facebook followers and we
Hmm.
have
Good.
millions of people read our website. So, I have to be optimistic.
Yeah. Well, there's reason to be, I suppose. I mean, the internet definitely does change things. We were talking to we were talking to Dr. Peter Treadway earlier, and he talked about how there's no internet freedom when you cross the border from Hong Kong into, well, there's some, but there's an awful lot of websites you just can't get once you get over into the mainland because they're blocked, because the Chinese government is afraid that people are going to find out. And I suppose as long as we have that freedom, that it's very, very difficult to keep the truth from people. And I would guess, as your colleague Jeff Deist has suggested in the past, that at some point in time, this military interventionism that's going on all around the world, when the American people start to have an awful lot of difficulty putting food on their tables, might start questioning the trillions of dollars that we're spending overseas with military intervention. It certainly was during the Vietnam days when people were asked to put their lives on the line when there was a draft, that the students raised almighty hell about that. And I
Yeah.
suppose that once people start to realize that there's a connection between their their poverty and the military-industrial complex, and then start questioning how much safer are we for being all over the world. I mean, it seems to me that there's a growing Islamic radicalism right here in our own country that seems to be not being reduced by all this intervention, but
Yeah.
actually being increased to a great extent.
Well,
Wouldn't you think that's the case?
sure. And I think one thing that could help people when they started having trouble putting food on their table, and a lot of them are, is to drive up to Washington and drive around to where the people live who work in the military industrial complex. Look at all the $1 million homes they lived in. They
Yeah,
live in. Look in the parking lots of these companies at all the brand new 7 Series BMWs and all of these things.
sure.
People are making an absolute killing off of middle America, literally and figuratively, and unfortunately, to this point, they've been able to wrap it in a flag and trick everyone. But I think you're right, Jay. I think it will come to a point where people are going to say, "Hey, something is wrong here. We're
Yeah,
no safer after 20 years of war on terror, and now they say that we have to have another couple wars.
yeah.
Something's fishy here. Let's hope that happens."
Well, Daniel, the thing is, as long as we have the internet and we have YouTube and we have replays of some of the things that Ron Paul said when he was running for president, like the reason they're over here is because we're over there, and those replays come on, and people start to gather there starts to gather some momentum with regard to what is really true, And when people are uncomfortable and things aren't going so well, they're more likely to ask that question, as they did after 2000, 2008, 2009. People were really starting to question the wisdom of the Federal Reserve and all the bailouts and everything that was going on before 2008, 2009. Now, of course, we've had sort of things seem to be getting better, at least for Wall Street. But I don't think they're getting that much better for most Americans. But in fact, I think they're getting worse for most Americans, actually. But I guess there definitely is reason for hope, Daniel. And as you said, when you speak to Ron Paul, he cheers you up, and we have to keep trying to support each other. Those of us who really believe that we need to stick to good, strong principles that our country was based on, the founders gave to us. So I know that that's what Ron Paul's all about. I know that that's what you're all about. And I want to thank you again for sharing your ideas and your knowledge with us again, Daniel. Look forward to doing it next week if you're available, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Always pleasure to have you with us. Thank you very much, Daniel. Well, that's all the time we have for this week, folks. I do want to thank my brother and engineer Edwin Taylor for making this show logistically possible. And thanks to each of you for listening. Until next week, goodbye and God's blessings to you.